that engine we ran at about 1.1 thou on the mains with a 1030. It ran that sort of 1,000 odd horsepower for near on 7 years. And I actually posted the bearings online, and people were like, no way they've been in an engine. That's how good they were. But yeah.
Welcome to the HPA Tune-In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Jake Bain from Bain Racing in Australia. Jake specialises in developing cylinder heads and intake manifolds, and this is really where I think science and art form kind of cross paths. There's so much that goes into developing a cylinder head, and of course the intake manifold that's going to match it, and this really can make or break the power that our engine produces, particularly if we're dealing with a naturally aspirated engine where we don't have boost pressure to hide maybe a poorly designed or poorly ported intake manifold and cylinder head. This episode does get fairly down in the weeds, and there's a lot of complex topics that we discuss, but Jake fortunately does an amazing job of breaking these concepts down into plain English so that we can all understand it. We dive into the topic of airflow versus air velocity, what the difference is and why it's so important, and this really comes down to why just making your ports bigger so that they flow more air on a flow bench doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to perform when it goes onto the car. We talk about the surface finish of the ports and what we need to know there, as well as port dividers around the valves themselves, what we need to know, the do's and the do-nots. We also dive into the golf ball dimple effect and why that may or may not be the best option to apply to your ports. Interestingly, all of Jake's cylinder heads are hand ported, and personally I would have thought that in this day and age CNC porting would really be the only way to go, particularly to do this at scale, but we get Jake's take on why he still prefers hand porting and why this can deliver a better result than a CNC ported profile. We also get into the world of intake manifolds. We'll find out about what aspects we need to understand and how these affect performance, such as the runner length as well as the volume of the plenum chamber. So there's going to be a lot of great information here to get our teeth stuck into. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tune-In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place, and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the show, Jake. Thanks for joining us today. And like we always do with our guests, let's find out about your background, and specifically how you got an interest in cars and more specifically, I guess, engines.
Yeah, it was pretty much a family thing. My grandfather was actually Don Bain. He was the Australian champion TT racer, and he was the head engineer for Valicet race bikes in Australia in the 1920s, 1930s. He was also an airman in the Air Force. So, he was really, really big into, obviously, engines and stuff like that. And actually, one of his privates was actually Jack Bratham. So they become really good friends after the war when they come back. And my grandfather Don got him into bike racing, and he got third place out at Mount Druitt there, and then he went off to Europe and got on into four wheels and ended up in Formula One. But
the rest is kind of history.
yeah, pretty much, yeah. So I was surrounded by cars from my grandfather to my father. My dad was a panel beater and a frustrated mechanic, so he was always, I've got photos at like 3 years old, I'm under a car, with him. So
Learning to tinker.
yeah, it was going to happen.
So is it more an interest in cars that led to engines, or is the passion sort of driven around engines from the get-go?
Yeah, pretty much the science of engines, how they work, and me just trying to, nut out what they do. Like, people try and simplify an engine to an air pump, but there's so much more than that. There's a science that we're still learning. It doesn't stop. Look at Formula One now; they've just cracked 50% thermal efficiency. Doing little tricks like millicycle and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, it's
Yeah, we probably will never have a fully comprehensive understanding of everything, but I think that's one of the exciting parts about it. There's always something new to research and something new to learn. Before we get sort of too far into the engine side of things, what did your sort of childhood look like, and maybe sort of once you got to school, and what's your education look like at this point? Where did you see yourself going in the future, I guess, is the real question.
Originally I was going into arts. My first business was actually a screen printing business at 15. So I was racing BMX and doing all that sort of stuff. And I was more into the arts because I was surrounded by cars. So I wasn't overly interested. So I didn't leave school early. I went right through to year 12. So I stayed on. And in that time, from about 16 to my 20s, I probably built about 28 to 30 cars that I'd built, modified, sold on, and just getting experience and playing with different systems and different engines and all that sort of stuff. And then I went into the trades late and did like light automotive engineering, and then went into advanced EFI, and then started studying engineering online and doing all that sort of stuff. But I already had a really good understanding early. My father was very much exposing me to engineering theories sort of from 7 years of age, like he had me all the encyclopedia, and would get into engineering theories and chat. And so he was a very smart man for a panel beater. So
maybe panel beating and being smart are definitely not mutually exclusive. I'll probably add we'll get all the panel beaters listening offside with us if we don't clear that.
It's the social expectation of trade guys.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's probably also shifting a little bit. It's pretty clear these days you definitely don't need a university degree or a PhD to lead a very successful life. And I would also say that, with this sort of fear at the moment of AI taking over your job, it's going to be a fair few years, I imagine, before ChatGPT is going to be doing oil changes or a cam belt service on your car. So you're probably pretty safe 100%. if you're in some of the trades, I would expect.
Yeah. Probably the safest industry coming into the next 10 years, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so what did your sort of work trajectory look like? You mentioned your screen printing business at 15 and then sort of getting later into the trade. So fill us in a little bit.
Yeah, so I went in to actually help a friend in basically just general mechanics, because I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I basically had a side job sort of at home making money, and then I got into that, and then I was building bikes at the time. I had a bike accident, so I had a bit of time off there because I had to have surgery and bits and pieces. And then I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and then I got offered to run a shop out at Blacktown by a friend. So I ended up going in there. I spent probably 2 or 3 years there, and I thought, this is not what I want to do. And I'd already started a business sort of from home with my engines and stuff like that, doing engines for people and bits and pieces from home. And then I pretty much sort of branched out about 99, 2000. I was sort of doing both. So I was working through the day and then doing engines at night and on the weekend. And then I actually got into a shop probably in about 2000. Yeah, I started welding then as well, so TIG welding, because originally I was just doing MIG. So it was really hard to try and test manifolds and build manifolds with a MIG welder and steel and stuff like that. But it gave me a starting point. And then once I got onto the aluminium, because I was doing a bit of subcontracting for a few different shops at that time. So Ross Balances was one I was helping a fair bit with, because he was building balances for our boat races and that sort of stuff. I started doing a bit of subcontracting work for Ross, and in the meantime, I was jumping on his TIG welder and learning how to TIG.
Expanding your skills the whole way.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, still doing a lot of engine stuff. And obviously, then I started helping Roscoe with balances and harmonics and stuff like that, because we got right into that with the boats and endurance races. The dampening effect is really shows up quickly in engine bearings and stuff like that. So 33 minutes at 8,800. If the harmonics aren't right, you find out about it really quickly. Where in drag racing you don't see that as much because it's very short, limited type racing.
Plus, you're transitioning always through the rev range as opposed to holding at a certain RPM.
Exactly.
I mean, just a little side quest. Let's just dive into that a little bit. And I think harmonic dampers are probably something that is largely misunderstood. I think the expectation from those that are, just have a cursory level of understanding of engine building and machining is you get the engine balanced. We hear that term. So hence, if the engine is balanced, well, why do we have harmonics? So let us know what we're actually missing here. What are we not understanding?
Well, basically, when an engine's revving at, even at idle at 1,000 RPM, it's actually doing like 900, 1,100, 900, 1,100 every compression cycle. As we start to compress that air, the crankshaft slows down and twists up. And then when the piston explodes and starts to accelerate from that sort of 10 to 15 degrees after TDC, the crank speeds up again. So we create a harmonic wave in the crankshaft, which creates an amplitude and a frequency wave, right? So that amplitude is what we're trying to actually dampen. I ended up building the test rig for Ross when he started bringing out all these metal jacket series, and actually testing what sort of frequency difference you'll see, because ATI and Innovative West, which we used to be a distributor for, they get right into this sort of stuff, especially where you want it quiet. So if you've got an engine at 8 or 9,000 that sings constantly, you don't care about how much noise it has at $2,000. You want it quiet at that point at where you're using it all the time.
The other element that goes hand in hand with this as well is where you have a resonant frequency, and we need to make sure that we sort of stay away or dampen out that resonant frequency. Is that correct?
Yes, 100%. And you'll get it right through valve springs and everything like that. You've seen that in NASCAR when they actually RPM limited their engines. They ended up right in a resonant spot. And ended up costing them engines because the spring wasn't designed for that RPM. They just, pulled them from 9,000, I think, to 7.5 or something like that. And they had all sorts of problems because now they'll bang in that resonance.
So in other words, you've gone to a lower RPM, which on face value would seem to be an improvement for engine reliability and longevity, but now you're operating at a resonant frequency. So things are going to fail much faster than at a higher RPM.
100%. That's right.
Everything you're saying here sounds like a harmonic dampener needs to be specifically tuned to the exact engine combination that it's running on. And I mean, just what you've mentioned here sounds like even working out how to match a dampener to an engine would be very complicated, yet we have off-the-shelf options. So again, what am I missing here?
Yeah, it just comes down to how deep you're getting into an engine. Most of the balancers on the market don't do a great job at harmonic dampening. Factory balancers will actually do a better job. And this is something I talked about, with Roscoe. Like, he was supplying dampeners that had a really hard rubber in it, and I would say to him that a dampener needs to be a sacrificial anode, like your brake pads. There's no point giving me a dampener that's going to outlast the engine, the bearings, and everything. Just like there's no point supplying a set of brake pads that are going to chew through rotors. We want that dampener to break down. That means it's actually working. That energy's going into it and it's breaking it down. So if it's too stiff, it's not going to dampen the harmonics. And that's what we've seen on the test bench. The amplitudes were too high, which means we still have crank flex, and that goes into the durability and also the life cycle of the crankshaft. That's why, like, now it's really easy with a lot of the billet options out there, because we're not, even if the harmonics are bad, we're not going to stress that crank terribly much. But it was far more important in the old days, and now in certain race series, it's much more important where they're really, on the limit of the engine. They want to, get everything right,
Okay, so there's a few follow-up questions there. and this is a bit of a rabbit hole that we've dived down early, but I'm here for it. It's interesting. You mentioned you'll see this in the race boats in the bearings. So if you've got a mismatch or a dampener that is not doing its job, how will this show up on the bearings? Are you going to end up with a bearing failure?
Yes, yeah. So the higher the amplitude gets in the harmonics, the more the crankshaft starts to move around in the engine, and you can start creating whipping in the crankshaft and all sorts of problems. So, yeah, bearing degradation. We've seen this with years ago. I can't remember the manufacturer, but they brought out all these billet underdrive pulleys, I think for Subarus and WRXs. It was like mid 2000s or something like that.
Still pretty popular with those.
Yeah, and they ended up having a lot of bearing failures from it because they've basically taken all the dampening out of the engine. You know?
It reminds me, years and years ago, I had a turbo B18C on my dyno. It's an old EG Civic, and halfway through a run on the dyno, I just heard this crack through my headset, and immediately aborted the run, shut the thing down, and it had fractured the oil pump. Pulled it all apart. The oil pump was literally split in two, and that's a direct drive off. For those who aren't sort of Honda B series people, that's a direct drive off the crankshaft. And what we ended up sort of deducing had happened there, it was a result of a solid front pulley instead of the factory harmonic dampener. And when you sort of start digging into that, that was quite a well known and understood failure mode. So just again highlighting the dangers of not having any dampening at all.
That's right. Yep.
Second follow-up question to that was, it sounds like, and I'm pretty sure this is exactly the case, these you said are sacrificial, hence they are a wear item. What's the process here? How long between rebuilds or replacement for the average harmonic dampener?
It really depends on how severe the engine is. Obviously, the higher we go up in comp, so once you start talking 15, 16 to 1 comp engines, obviously, as you can imagine, we've got more amplitude because the compression strokes are higher, and then
so you get that slowing effect on compression and the acceleration effect on the combustion.
Yeah. And exactly, and the separation becomes far greater, right? So then the balancers work much harder. But generally, most guys will get through a season with like the ATIs, and they buy the O-ring rebuild kit and stuff like that. The fluid dampeners, they tend to last a lot longer. The innovative West type ones, I run a lot of them for a lot of years, and they just go year after year because they're a silicon-based one, so they don't wear, they just create heat, and because they're an aluminium body, they just shed the heat, right?
Okay. So on that note, pros and cons between a fluid-style dampener and an elastomer-based one?
Much. They both have good points. There's some cheap fluid dampeners that don't work well, but the innovative West, they've got it down pat. They're really, really good. They're a science in themselves, like how they've developed the silicon fluid and the right viscosity and stuff like that, you know?
Okay. All right, let's get back to our main topic now that we've parked a little side quest. But building race engines, I'm just interested in your take on this. How do you learn this skill? And where I'm going with this to sort of broaden out the question I'm really asking here, if you go through an apprenticeship and become a mechanic, there's elements of engine overhaul that you will learn, although let's be honest, these days, no mechanic in a franchise dealership is rebuilding an engine. You don't do that. So I kind of feel that on that front, for the general mechanics, it's kind of a bit of a dying skill set. Then we've got engine reconditioning as a career path. And obviously, yes, there you're going to learn about machining and building engines. I would wager that 95% of general engine reconditioners are only reconditioning probably pedestrian car engines where specs, clearances, tolerances aren't at the same level you'd need to be at when you're building an engine that might be making 2-3 times the factory power level and revving 2,000-3,000 RPM higher. So first part, do you agree with that? My take on that?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, a hell of a lot more work goes into, like a reconditioned engine, guys are spending 16 to 20 hours. A race engine can be 40 to 100 hours. And it comes down to, and every series is different. I've been sort of lucky because I've had my toe in, endurance engines and drag racing. Like in a drag car, you could pretty much buy a set of springs and drop them straight in the cylinder head and run them. Where an endurance engine, you're deburring, you're sanding edges, you're making sure everything is absolutely perfect, because the thermal overload in an engine that does 30 minutes will be reached where in a engine they won't, right? They warm them up to 160 Fahrenheit roughly, they run them down the track, they're done. There's no, the springs won't overload at all, where in a circuit car or an endurance boat or something like that, sitting at big RPM, as you know, every time we compress that spring, we're generating heat. And then how they sit on the shim and how they sit on the retainer, tiny little square edges that wouldn't be a drama in a drag car become a problem in an endurance engine, you know?
Yeah, I think I've sort of often thought to myself, making 1,000, 2,000 horsepower for 6, 7, 8 seconds down a drag strip sounds brutal, but the reality is, as you sort of alluded to there, it's actually in a lot of ways more difficult to hold a lower horsepower, lower RPM engine together over a 30-minute, 1 hour, 6 hour endurance race. And then when you get into marine stuff, it's just a whole different ball game, because there's no way in an automotive based application you're going to ever be able to hold wide open throttle for 45 minutes in one go, whereas that's very much the case for some marine applications, correct?
Yeah, 100%. Yep. Thermal loads, coatings, everything come into it then,
Yeah.
But like you said, it's that saturation time, how much heat we're putting into it. And even with compression ratios, you can overcomp. Well, pretty much all our drag engines are overcomped, You can run 14, 15 to 1 or E85 in a drag engine, but you can't run, or your limitations are sort of 13 and a half in a circuit engine, because we can saturate that heat into the cylinder head in 8-10 seconds. But once we reach that saturation limit, now we're starting to trip into detonation and hot spots and stuff like that. So there are other aspects we need to look at.
So essentially what you're saying there is, with a higher compression ratio for an endurance application, or even just a road race application, you're going to find that you're running into a detonation or knock limit, which you wouldn't see in an 8 to 10 second run down a strip.
That's right.
On that basis, and again, kind of probably a little bit of a tangent to the main topic, but with compression ratio, it's one of those things where I think it's really easy to sort of fall into the trap of more is better. And I'm sure to a degree it can be. I haven't been in a situation myself where I've had budget or capacity or time to build the same engine with 4 or 5 different compression ratios, being the only change, then dyno test them to actually figure the lay of the land out for myself. And I think I probably am in the same boat as the majority of performance engine builders. It takes a big budget to be able to go through those things and actually find out. As you start getting up in the compression ratio, maybe north of, say, 14 to 1, I'm guessing as well you get into the situation of the dome on the piston can start interfering with flame front propagation. So while on paper the additional compression may be an advantage, the reality is that it sort of becomes a moot point. Is there any truth in that, or am I on the wrong track?
Yeah, 100%. Especially with the old cylinder heads, that was a big thing, and you see this now. Like, we have factory motorbikes at 12.5 to 1. You couldn't do that 20 years ago, and that come down to the chamber design. So, and we have something that we call surface area to compression ratio. So the least amount of surface area to compression ratio I have, the more stable the flame front will be. And that's exactly what you described. The big lumpy top domes that we had before had a lot of surface area, and the flame front had so far to travel, where now all the modern chambers, like a lot of the Ford stuff we see there, 37 cc's, really, really small chamber, and all the pro stock stuff now, super, super small chamber. The top chamber is basically within a degree of the top seat angle. We have a beautiful discharge coefficient, and the piston is almost flat.
Yeah.
So we have a far better nucleus. That kindling when it starts at the plug can spread out a lot more evenly, and we can get even pressure. So we can also get more torque for the same amount of bang, because we're hitting the piston all at once. It's not running across a dome and trying to, expand from there. So
are you getting it? I might be a little off topic on a tangent here, but are you sort of getting at the point where this is going to depend on how much ignition timing you have to run? If you've got essentially a slow flame front propagation, you're going to need to start the spark event earlier in the engine cycle in order to achieve peak cylinder pressure at the optimal point. So all of the build-up and pressure that you've got while the piston is still coming up to TDC on the compression stroke is kind of counterproductive. It's fighting against the piston. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that also comes into play, but just generally how much more surface area. If you think about, say, your big block, your massive lumpy top piston and a big chamber, 128cc chamber with a lumpy top, say 13.5:1. If we redesign that chamber and make it a 90cc chamber and now flat top piston at the exact same compression, the one with the smaller chamber will have less surface area.
Yep.
And it's that surface area ratio to compression ratio that creates the instability in the flame front because it's got further to travel, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. It's a tricky one because you can't maybe necessarily change a parameter such as combustion chamber volume while keeping everything else consistent. And my mind sort of, a lot of this is difficult to discuss without the aid of drawings, which doesn't lend itself nicely to podcasting, but hopefully everyone can follow along. Where I'm going with this is, in my mind at least, as we reduce combustion chamber volume, particularly that dramatically, sort of 125 down to say 37 cc's you mentioned, that's going to have an impact on the valve angle, which then affects port angle, flow, etc. So there's a huge number of knock-on events. Is that correct?
100%, yeah. So the early stuff you'd see, like let's say talk small block Chev 23 degree. The closer we get to that, 10 to 12 seems to be the sweet spot. Pretty much everything's around that. Even your modern LS is pretty close to it. All your aftermarket Ford big block, even your 13 degree type small block stuff. That was when we really started to make, we're making 950,000 horsepower NA, on 430 cube type stuff. But you could never do that with a 23 degree because they are a wedge head. The chamber was horrible. And that's why you needed to, try and do every sort of trick you possibly can to make it better. But the port was very low. We had a horrible short turn. So as we stand the valve up, we can also lift the port up as well,
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's sort of come back to the original question. And this is more around, so how did you build up this knowledge that you've obviously got a massive knowledge at this point? And I'm sure a lot of it has purely come from just being in there, doing the work and seeing the results. But how did you sort of go from building garden variety engines to, race engines?
Just who I got involved with, just different people. And I had fairly good success with street strip engines in the 90s and early 2000s. We were doing, 11-second Holden package type engines, they were cookie cutter type engines, but they'd make sort of 450 horsepower and, they'd pretty much go 118 to 122 mile an hour in your Commodores and stuff like that. And then I just sort of went further and further. At the same time, I was into a lot of boosted stuff, and that teaches you a lot of lessons as far as parts life, valve quality, piston quality, ring quality, and all that sort of stuff. So I fed that into the NA stuff as well, because they work hand in hand. People try and treat them differently, but the best NA engine is just an absolute brilliant boosted engine.
There's a couple of points that I'll sort of chuck in there, at least from my own experience. Having spent the majority of my life dealing mostly with boosted engines, I kind of always relished the handful of opportunities I've had to do work and develop a naturally aspirated engine. I feel that when you're dealing with a naturally aspirated engine, you've just got nowhere to hide. You can't fix a lack of horsepower by turning the boost up 2 psi. So in a lot of ways, building a turbocharged engine is, in my opinion, mainly around choosing components with sufficient strength to cope with the power that you're going to be producing. And if you can kind of do that, the rest is, I would say the rest, I'm very much simplifying this, but it comes down to turbocharger sizing and then tuning. Now, yes, once you start getting a bit further into it, yeah, it does start acting like a well-developed naturally aspirated engine. Add a turbocharger, it's going to be an even better thing. And to the point where if you start looking as well, my sort of line in the sand was around the relationship between inlet manifold pressure and exhaust back pressure in a turbo engine. And for a typical street engine in stock form, that might be 2-to-1 in favour of exhaust back pressure. And they do that obviously for response. And with my old drag car, we were just under that 1-to-1. So I had a little bit more inlet manifold pressure than back pressure. And I kind of felt, and you'll know, you'll be able to tell me if I was on the right track or completely out the gate. I always felt that once you got that relationship below 1-to-1, then the engine started responding more like a naturally aspirated engine, particularly in terms of the cam profile you could select.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, because now that overlap, so our exchange rate is identical to NA, because the pressure differential between intake and exhaust is like it would be NA. And that's where a lot of people go wrong with boosted engines. They look at them as additional boost, or boosted versus NA. But that's why I talk about all engines are boosted by 14.7 pounds of atmospheric pressure. All we're doing is changing that pressure ratio. And like you said, once you start getting that intake to BPs around that 1-to-1, that's exactly what you're going to see. Yeah.
Now, for those listening to this thinking that the solution to making heaps more power in their street engine is just to put a bigger turbocharger on and get that back pressure down, well, yes, you're right, it will, but just on that drag engine of mine that I'm referring to, which was a 4G63, we didn't really see much in the way of usable boost pressure until 7,000 RPM. So on the street, a stock Evo would have probably dusted me easily.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, let's move on a little bit. At what point did you sort of really hit the ground running with your current race engine business?
Probably like 2002, 2003, and at the same time we were starting to build some manifolds for some big engine guys and stuff like that. So they were really, really good. Pretty much everyone, even today, like some of the pro stock and super stock guys I work with, they give me a ton of feedback. So like I say, we can all learn together, and they've helped me dramatically, So yeah, sort of from that sort of point, I started getting a little bit more serious with engines and bits and pieces. So yeah, 1UZs, and so the twin cam stuff, and a little bit of push rod stuff, but I phased more into for my building type stuff, more in the twin cam, NA and boosted, and then we went a lot more serious with our manifold development in NA, and that's when we started to started breaking some records and bits and pieces, and top holding NA, and 1UZs, and yeah.
Okay, you've sort of alluded to a fairly wide variety of applications for your engines. You've sort of said marine, drag strip, obviously, street, circuit. How did you find these customers? What are you doing to sort of market your services to these industries?
I never did. They found me. I don't know how, but people would walk in and say, "You're the man," and it was really just word of mouth back then.
So reputation was everything.
Yeah, that's it. And I was pretty much a stickler for, clearances and stuff like that. All my engines I wanted within 0.2 of a thou. That was how I built them. I also, I built them on the tighter side of things rather than the looser side. But at the same time, I was on thinner viscosity oils because I wanted more cooling. I wanted more volume, less pressure, because as you know, even in NASCAR, they used to turn oil pressure down just for qualifying, right? Because people don't realize that's a workload that takes away from horsepower, right?
Totally.
So, yeah, even with our RBs now, we're still only on a 1040, and we've got people putting 60 weight oil in them and wondering why they've got head drain problems,
Okay, let's talk about that. Every time you start talking, I find another topic that I want to dive into. But the bearing clearance versus oil viscosity is a pretty hot one. I've probably gone the opposite way in terms of building slightly looser than a stock clearance and then moving up in oil viscosity. And I think, like a lot of engine builders, we tend to be a little bit superstitious. I started down that route. It worked. I didn't have bearing failures, and I pull an engine apart and the bearings looked like the day I put them in. So on that basis, tick the box, happy with that, it's working, let's never ever change it. So I'm not saying that my way is the only way, but I guess the background premise behind that is the crankshaft, and even to the degree the engine block when it's on the workbench and we're building it at room temperature, is rigid. It seems absolutely rock solid. But the reality is when you're pumping out maybe 1,000 horsepower and revving to 8, 9, 10,000 RPM, the crankshaft probably resembles more like a noodle, and even the block is flexing. So the idea is we open the clearances out a little bit to prevent metal-to-metal contact between the journal and the bearing, and we make up for that lost oil pressure by going to a thicker or heavier viscosity oil. Is there any validity in that, given that your technique would appear to be the opposite way?
It's hard to say. So if you look at like pro stock and stuff, I think they're on like 0.5 oils now and down near like 1.2 thou, like super tight. You look at NASCAR, same thing. You look at...
I would say there's a difference between a bespoke purpose-built race engine, however, and when we're trying to modify heavily a production block and crankshaft, because those engines can be designed with everything in mind so that the component will have the required rigidity. So I don't know if that's kind of an apples with apples comparison.
Oh, 100%. It comes down to component strength. That's definitely like Cleveland's your best example. Those crankshafts used to move around all the time, you know. But at the same time, the more room you give them, the more room they're going to move as well. So there's a two-part fold there. Like I had guys building Cleveland's at 3.5 thou blowing, making 1,000 odd horsepower. We ran them at 2.4 with, 1540s and stuff like that. And the bearings come out and they were just as good. We weren't giving away as much horsepower. We were seeing better life in valve springs and better cooling and stuff like that. So I think that people just play it safe, run a thicker oil and bigger clearance,
That's exactly what I would say I'm doing. I think it's also horses for courses like, hey, NASCAR or pro stock go where a few horsepower could be the difference between qualifying on the front of the grid and not. Sure, I get that. Whereas when I'm drag racing and I can turn the boost up another quarter of a PSI if I want to make another 10 horsepower, I sort of weigh that up. Where would I prefer to sort of play it safe? That's kind of my where my mind sits on it.
Yeah. The other balance is bearing surface pressure. So from like 2 thou to 3 thou, we increase the surface pressure by about 80%-ish, even though it's only a 33% increase in clearance or so. So, and now we're seeing that in RBs. So like I talked to a few of the guys, Con from CRD and all that, and like he was actually dynoing one of my engines, and I think they're up around 190 PSI oil pressure to keep bearings in these things. Yeah, they're like massive, right?
Holy shit.
And he rang me and goes, man, this engine's only got 75 PSI. I said, man, it's tons. It's 1040 and the engine's like 1.8 thou and we're doing 8,000 RPM. That engine's done 7 years now. And the bearings, like they've cooked cylinder heads on it, tuners have detonated the engine, everything. And now you're seeing a lot of them need to go to a wider journal because that's the other drama. If we go from 2 thou to 3 thou, we're increasing that surface pressure. It's that stiletto heel theory. We're reducing surface area. And this is where you're seeing a lot of people getting into trouble in the boosted game,
I think that's probably an aspect of the increased bearing clearance that a lot of people just wouldn't actually put two and two together and think about that. So I'm glad you raised that, actually.
Yeah. Well, actually, a female engineer found it in the 90s in NASCAR. They started eating engines. They were running 3 thou, and she explained the stiletto heel theory. I can't remember her name, but I remember getting told the story by a good Yankee friend that I was talking to. And they actually reduced the bearing clearance, and all their bearing problems went away. So we're seeing a few guys now at 2,000 odd horsepower with bearing delamination problems. And I tell them, I said, pull 4/10 out of it and try it, And sure enough, they pull a bit of clearance out of it and their bearing problems go away, So, yeah, it's a dance.
Yeah, of course. I think, like anything, it's difficult to have a black and white rule. On that basis, though, this probably isn't a rule, it's more of a rule of thumb, which has always been that in imperial units, about a thou of clearance per inch of journal diameter is at least a sensible starting place. Does that still hold true?
Yeah, I run about probably 0.7 to 0.8 of that.
Yeah, okay, yep.
Yeah, but again, like you said, it comes down to, if you've got a 4340 crank, it's super strong, you've got a nice rigid block, you've got 4-bolt mains or, like with the 1UZ stuff, they're all 6-bolt type stuff. As I said, I run them at like 1.8 at 9,500 RPM. A really great example of this was the GT40 we did, I think in 2005, 2006. I think it was one of the world's fastest Mark II when we did it. And it was the first of the, we designed between me and Bobby, the owner, we designed a AC-based cooling system. So I built an intercooler in the back. We had a radiator up the front that flashed 90% of the heat off. Then it come into the cab and went into the box where we had the evaporator inside the car and ran some copper pipe, and then it went back out. And it actually worked far better than I thought it would. So it ran around 19 psi, made 1,000 horsepower. It was the 4.6 Cobra engine. You probably know it. That was sort of Ford's introduction into the 4-valve, and now they've got the Coyotes and stuff like that. So it was pretty much that generation one, the Italian block, the really good block. We were seeing 16 to 18 degrees rain, hail or shine on that. It was so stable because we had a thermatic switch in it, so we could control water temperature. Yeah, it was really, really efficient. It actually blew me away. But that engine we ran at about 1.1 thou on the mains with a 1030. It did 7 years of racing and street driving, and he was very hard on the circuit. So it did about 40 to 50,000 Ks. We pulled that down and the bearings were like brand new. But, Ford, it had a forged crankshaft from the factory. We run the forged crankshaft. We put a good set of rods, put a set of mild pistons in it, and pretty much everything else was standard other than ARP kits. But as I said, it ran that sort of 1,000 odd horsepower for near on 7 years. And I actually posted the bearings online, and people were like, no way they've been in an engine. That's how good they were. But yeah.
Yeah, it's nice when they come out looking that good.
Yeah. So no, I've definitely pushed the limits on clearance to see sort of, where they bite me, and I haven't found it yet.
Of course, if you find that point, it ends pretty badly and pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, that's the saying, isn't it?
Yeah. I guess it's worth mentioning here that this all sort of goes hand in hand with a really good quality oil, but probably goes without saying no one's going to be putting sort of a cheap Repco mineral grade oil in an engine that's built to that sort of spec. So in terms of the bearing clips, before we move on as well, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you've also had plenty of experience in billet alloy blocks.
A little bit, not as much, no. So probably a handful of billet alloy blocks, and probably more in the boat scene than in RBs and stuff like that. So we've done a few in them.
The reason I ask is there's sort of been a bit of debate. It might have settled down over the last few years. We kind of instigated it with an interview that we did at World Time Attack a few years back, where basically it was an argument that a full billet block really isn't streetable. And Darren from Bullet Race Engines kind of took offence to that because he's got plenty that are in street cars. So fair play. I guess where it comes to is the problem with a full billet alloy block is that the growth as it comes up to temperature is significantly higher. So you either have a very, very tight bearing clearance at room temperature, which can be potentially dangerous until it heats up, or you put up with excessive clearance at operating temperature. Can you add anything to this? What's your take on that, and which way should we be going?
Yeah, 100%. You really want the alloy stuff tight, and that was even with Bob's GT40, they were a full alloy block, hence why we ran them so tight. Like I said, I think we're around about that on the mains, 1.1, 1.2, really, really tight, because the block will grow, 3 times faster than an iron block and 3 times bigger. And we've seen this with Paul Medill's stuff in the boat racing. So he was racing the 600 cube twin turbo full billet block type deal, and they're a 4-minute race. Those engines were going together at like 1.2, 1.3. They'd start off with 110 psi oil pressure and finish off with about 20. That's how much the block would, grow away from the crank. So that's definitely a thing. But yeah, we've got a couple of guys that street drive them, and they seem okay. But as I said, they're tight, and you definitely need a dry sump with them. Trying to use a factory pump you just don't have the volume.
Sure.
You really need the volume.
I think a lot of it comes down to education and understanding what you're dealing with. And, of course, if you've got the time and the inclination, there's nothing to stop you preheating the oil and coolant as well. And this sort of comes back to Formula One style engines where people think that they can't be turned over at room temperature. Obviously complete nonsense, but they do need to be pre-warmed before startup.
100%, yeah. And common sense, and just educating customers. This is why I sort of went away from the street guys and went to the race guys really, really early in my business, because I just found the street guys always have an answer. They always know, their mates always know, where the race guys, if I say you're running this oil, you warm it up to 80 degrees before you take it to this RPM, they just listen because they've broken enough engines and they've got enough experience to know they don't know, and they'll just listen to the engine builder, you know?
And let's be honest, this shit is not cheap as well.
No, that's exactly right. So any of the alloy guys, I tell them, I don't care what you do to it, drive it as hard as you like, but get it warm. I want the oil temperature at 70 degrees. I want this, I want that. And then once it's at that, do what you like, you know?
I'm interested in your take on this. Obviously, running a successful business building race engines, I kind of always wondered if it was a smart business model. So not trying to insult you here.
No,
I went through the same. But you're building an engine where every part that goes into that engine is expensive. The margins that we as the shop get off these is usually very small, or often the owner wants to bring you the parts himself, which is never great. So you're going to make a little bit of margin on the parts, a little bit maybe on the machining, and then obviously there's your labor. So the odds are really stacked against you because it's only going to take one single thing to go wrong, and that can be a complete walk-away loss, and then it's up to you to rebuild it. Any take on that?
100%. Yeah, it's a labor of passion, and you always end up putting more in. And you talk to anyone, like all the guys I know, the best porters in Australia and the engine builder, the same thing. You know, they're putting in way more hours than they charge. So it is definitely a labor for passion, but also it comes down to choosing the right customers. I know that sounds arrogant, but you really need someone responsible if you're doing that. And I noticed that once I transitioned from street guys that, you know, would just go to the local cul-de-sac and hold it on the rev limiter doing donuts all day versus a race guy that wants to win, you know? So since I transitioned into that, 99% of my stress went away. So
I think that your success is often dictated by the jobs you turn down or the customers that you fire. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that.
I think so, 100%. And I think, I know we talked about advice for new mechanics and other people starting their business, but the customer isn't always right. And you really should select the right customer for the right job. You can say no.
Yeah. It's hard. It is hard to say no to work, particularly when there's dollar signs hanging over that particular task, when you're fresh and new and you're hungry to make rent payments. So it's difficult to start with, and I think every business goes through the same trajectory. Originally, you'll take on anything that comes through the door, and after hopefully only a year or two, you start realizing that that's actually not the smartest way to grow your business and get a reputation.
Yeah, it almost took me a decade, but yeah. Yeah, definitely.
If you're a fan of the podcast and you're interested in topics like engine tuning, automotive wiring, performance engine building, 3D modeling in CAD, or anything else in the high-performance industry, I have something that you might be interested in. Introducing the High Performance Academy VIP package. This package of courses gives you lifetime access to all of HPA's online training for one price. These courses cover everything from tuning and reflashing petrol and diesel engines through to motorsport wiring, engine building, fabrication, design, car setup, and plenty more. Right now, you can get $500 off High Performance Academy's VIP package using the code PODCAST500 at checkout. Becoming a VIP means you'll never pay for another course again. You'll get instant access to all 40 plus courses we currently offer, plus every new course we ever release in the future. Want to define maps or tune with WinOLS? Curious about CAN bus devices or how CAD can help make your dream build a reality? These in-depth topics, as well as many others, each have their own dedicated course that are going to help you master whatever it is you want to learn. And as a VIP member, you're not just getting the courses, you'll also join HPA's online community with lifetime access to our member forums and members' webinar lessons. Again, the code is podcast500 for that $500 discount. Just head over to hpacademy.com to check out the full VIP package and everything it contains. All right, let's get back to the episode. Let's move on. What I really wanted to sort of talk about, we've wasted 40 odd minutes at this point. I wouldn't say wasted. It's been a great chat, but on side quest now, we want to get into sort of the meat and potatoes of this interview, which is really around cylinder head development, and later we'll talk about intake manifolds as well. Now, this is an area that I have never personally got involved with. First of all, it's fiddly work, and I don't like hanging on the end of a die grinder for hours and hours on end. And then you sort of get to the situation, you've done a great job on one port, and you're like, shit, now I've got to replicate that on another 7. That's tough. So I've kind of left this to those who are good at it, and I think probably most people do, but you're one of the people who is good at it. I think when it comes to porting cylinder heads, there's a misconception that bigger is better. And particularly, you see this thrown around when people start quoting flow bench numbers. And obviously, something that flows 300 CFM has got to be better than 200 CFM. So where's the disconnect here, and why is that not the case?
The disconnect comes down to velocity and the dynamic motion of the engine. So by that, I mean the cubic capacity and how much velocity it's going to drive through that duct. A flow bench will not tell us what the right size is for an engine. It'll only tell us how big that port flows. And anyone who's been on a flow bench will go down this rabbit hole. Probably my first 10 years on a flow bench was chasing flow figures and then realizing why they didn't make horsepower, because you can make that. If you keep making that hole bigger, it's going to flow more. But that doesn't translate to horsepower, and it doesn't translate once you start understanding average port velocity. So if you've got a really big growth rate from your valve to your window, it might look good on the flow bench, but then if you start doing some math and you start calculating how much air velocity you have at the window versus how much air velocity you have at the seat, and then the average velocity, a good port in 2 valve is going to start at about 270 feet per second and go up from there. And a good twin cam is going to start at about 300 feet per second and go up from there. So as you can imagine, the bigger we open the window, the more our average drops as far as velocity goes.
Which is still limited at the valve by the diameter of the valve and the valve seat, correct?
Yes, but let's say our valve is 2 square inches and then we've made our window 3 square inches. Well, if the valve is 2 square inches and flows 300 CFM, 300 feet per second, then the window's only going to do, say, 200-ish. So now if we add those two together and divide them by 2, now our average is only 250. So we've actually made the port go backwards, even though we've seen more CFM on the flow bench, because we're not looking at that velocity aspect.
Okay, cool. Right, let's dive into that a little bit deeper. Why is velocity so important?
Velocity is what creates our inertial supercharger effect. And I try to explain this to a lot of people, that air has weight. And the faster we drive it and the greater the average in the port, the more weight it has to push and fill that cylinder. Because people forget the filling stage isn't on the downstroke of the engine. Most of our inertia is working as the piston's coming up the bore. That's why we have timing after BDC. And even factory engines will have 50 degrees after bottom dead center.
So if we've got more velocity and hence more inertia, that would allow us to hold that valve open later into the compression stroke and get that sort of forced filling effect?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Okay. And I think that's an aspect of air and airflow that, again, for those who've really never delved into it, the inertia aspect, or the fact that air has a mass, is something that's quite foreign.
It is, that's right, because it feels like nothing.
Yeah, but it does in fact have mass. Okay, so we've got these two kind of competing metrics, air velocity, and we've got our cubic feet per minute, our air flow. How do you then kind of balance these two out and just not go out chasing bigger CFM numbers when you know that the velocities, and how do you size this to a specific engine or application?
We target to its Mach limit, so it's dynamic. So what we do is we calculate what the running engine would need, and generally the limit is anywhere from 620 feet per second to 710 feet per second. So it's like 0.55 Mach to 0.6 Mach, and that's basically a division of the speed of sound, 1116 feet per second. If we just times that by 0.6, that'll give you your airspeed, right? So what I'll do is calculate what the minimal cross-sectional area is in that engine, and that's the restrictor. So if we've got, a 4-inch ball by 3-inch stroke, like a small block Chevy or something like that, or 350 stroke, and we're saying 8,000 RPM, then I'll calculate what the minimal cross-sectional area needs to be before the engine chokes. So we size that duct to match the peak RPM. So that way we know we're getting as much airspeed as we possibly can before the point of degradation, right? Before we start choking the engine. So in other words, we're trying to create as much force as we possibly can to keep pushing air in as that cylinder pressure rises. And you can feel that pressure. If you put your hand out the window, just even at 100 kilometers an hour, you can feel how much pressure you feel on your hand. Now times that by 6 or 7, and that's roughly what we're seeing in an intake port. And it's that inertia and that velocity that continues to fill the engine as the piston's coming up the bore. So, yeah.
What drives that limit of, I think it was at 0.6? Basically, why can't we just go higher and get more inertia?
The physics of air. So it comes down to the boundary layer and the pressure drop. So at, let's say 600 feet per second, I think we're around about nearly a PSI pressure drop. So it's a balance between density and velocity, and as well as temperature. So the higher velocity we have, the more boundary swell we also get. So that's another aspect, because as the air velocity starts to increase, the boundary layer will expand in the port. So we start to reduce the cross-sectional area. This is why RA finish texture in the port is so important, getting the right texture and stuff like that,
Okay. Again, every time you answer one question, you just bring up another 3 or 4 questions that need to be covered off. So, boundary, or actually, no, let's come back one step. So this is sort of Bernoulli's principle. As velocity comes up, increases, pressure drops. That's what you're talking about with the air density actually reducing. So you sort of get to this point where, you could increase the air velocity, but the reduction in the air density kind of cancels it out. Is that what you're sort of getting to?
It's a multitude of things.
Because you've got boundary layer as well, reducing the cross-sectional area.
Yeah, because the boundaries layer is actually changing the cross-sectional area, and the higher the velocity we get, the more engagement and the more friction we create in the boundary layer and in the airstream. So you start intermixing, because a lot of people think intakes are a laminar flow. They're all turbulent. It's about how we can minimize the turbulence and minimize the skin friction in the port. That's what we do as porters or engine guys. How gently can we get that air in the port, and how fast can we get it in without cooking the air? Because as we increase velocity as well and the boundary layer starts to thicken, we start getting more convection. So now not only are we choking the engine as far as the hole size starts to reduce, but we're starting to lose that density in as far as air temperature. So air temperature starts to spike, and this is where you'll see engines just fall off the dyno, because now the mass disappears. You might be getting the volume in, but you're not getting the molecular density in there, right?
Yeah, it's the air mass that we need, not just volume.
100%.
All right, now let's come back to boundary layer. I mean, it's probably a bit of a hint in the name. I imagine most people can probably pick up the pieces and figure out what a boundary layer is. But you mentioned the surface finish roughness average RA value for your port wall, and I think again, those who are new to it, and I certainly had this opinion back 25 years ago when I first got started out, that a mirror smooth finish. And I mean, I think this probably comes from the old term port and polish. So a mirror smooth finish on your port wall surely is the sort of the go-to option. Not the case. What do we need to know?
Definitely the worst thing you can do is polish. Yeah. That belongs in the exhaust. So we need to understand that the intake and exhaust are two different environments. The intake is very cold, wet, and sticky, and it has a very low Mach limit. So we can only accelerate air so fast at like 600 feet per second, where the exhaust is very hot, dry, and smooth. We have, due to air is affected by temperature more than anything as far as its speed limitations. So if we've got super hot gas, we can flow far greater velocity factors, even though the Mach index will stay the same, but we've moved the speed limit from 1100 feet per second to maybe 2000. So now we can do 12, 13, 1400 feet per second in the exhaust. So this is why we want a mirror polished in the exhaust. And the other aspect that feeds into the exhaust is our thermodynamic aspect, because kinetic energy is heat. So the less convection we have into the cylinder head, the more that velocity carries out the engine, the more we can use that inertia on the exhaust side of things to send a negative wave back into the intake to help overlap and stuff like that. But yeah, on the intake side, because we're dealing with a cold gas and generally in a wet environment, if it's carbureted or fuel injected or whatever it may be, we want an active boundary layer in most turbulent flow regimes anyway. We want to trip that up. We don't want a no-slip regime, right? We don't want it grabbing on the floor. What we want is like little ball bearings and making the air slip and trip over itself. So we need a certain amount of RA, a certain amount of texture, and the optimal range seems to be between 100 and 200 from our testing and everyone I sort of talk to around the world. And that's probably like a 40 grit to a burr finish.
Okay, it's actually quite rough.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you related that to a grit, because most people won't. An RA number is probably pretty meaningless to most people.
100%.
I guess one thing I just wanted to kind of add to that when you're talking about the exhaust and the speed of sound, we just need to understand, for those who aren't aware, that's heavily related to the temperature. So that's why it's dramatically different between intake and exhaust.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. So if we're talking about the port finish and the intake, this probably comes to the inevitable conversation about the golf ball dimple effect, which is kind of it's come, it's gone. Some people swear by it, others ridicule it. I'm on the fence here. I've never tested. What's your take on this?
It defies physics. So if we understand what it does on a ball, basically the whole point of a dimple is to create more turbulence, a thicker boundary layer, and trip the air even more to turn around the ball. And this helps with the pressure recovery of the ball and also reduces that negative pressure wake behind the ball. That's what makes it go faster. And you only need dimples at our separation point. You don't need them all over, but a ball spins, so we have to put them all over, right?
Of course.
So what a golf ball is doing is sacrificing more skin friction, so more surface drag, for that reduction behind the ball. It's actually the parachute, that negative pressure pulling on the ball, that stops it flying much faster. So the dimples don't help it directly, they help it indirectly by reducing the wake behind that negative pressure. And also they reduce the negative pressure behind the ball. So you don't get as much negative pressure behind the ball. So the pressure recovery is much higher with dimples. So in a port aspect, there's no behind the port. So all we're getting is a negative aspect. We're getting more drag, we're getting a thicker boundary layer, and that's what it shows on the dyno. They just sign off. What a lot of people have been tricked into is they've had ports that are too big, they dimple them, and it worked for them.
So effectively reducing the port cross-sectional area with the boundary layer.
100%, right? And you'll see that, but they still narrow the horsepower curve, because while velocity is low, the boundary layer won't swell, but then as it starts to come in, then it peaks much quicker and then chokes the engine off. And pretty much me and everyone I know that's tested this has seen the same thing.
So we can sort of throw this in the bin and call it junk science. It's just marketing hype, doesn't work.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. The only areas that I can see it works is in real low velocity areas. If you've got a really, really bad port, and I've had this discussion with a few people, like behind the guide where the bowl is, right? If you dimple that, you'll see some improvements. But then at the same time, if we fill that, shark fin it, fix the turbulence that wrapped around the guide and caused two crashing waves into each other, and done a nice tail fin in the port, then not only have we reduced port volume, so we've increased port velocity, now we've made it better all round. So like, it's a Band-Aid that you can use, but there's other ways to do it.
You see, better to fix the actual root cause of the problem rather than try and chuck a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, but where I would say it can work is on pistons and inside a chamber, where the boundary thickness isn't a limitation of flow. It keeps fuel off. So you'll see this with, I think it's, air of piston, the diesel manufacturers and stuff. They're starting to do the dimple pistons now. I haven't seen any ABA testing on it, but as far as the physics go, a thicker boundary layer on the top of the piston will help keep fuel off it. So technically, by the physics, it would work, but we'd have to see a proper ABA test. So we used to use it inside chambers in the early 2000s where we'd see a bit of wetting. It was just poor chamber, poor valve angle. Now, with better chambers, there's no need for it. But in the early days, we used to do little corners of the chamber. And I think even GM Performance actually released some of their performance engines with dimples on their pistons, which they showed, I think, 3 or 5% better fuel economy, so.
Yeah, okay. All right.
But yeah, definitely a Band-Aid.
All right, as part of that, you just mentioned sort of a shark fin around the guide. This is another part that I want to talk about. A lot of, my experiences, I guess, predominantly with 4-valve import style cylinder heads, and it's quite often that the guide will be completely cut away to the port wall and just ported as part of the intake port. Is this viable? Does this work? Or are we better to profile the guide and maybe the cylinder head around the guide?
Yeah, you're definitely always better to profile it, because think about it. If we take it out, then we have this, telegraph pole standing up in the middle of the port velocity. As the air comes in, it's going to crash into that valve stem. So the more shrouds we can put around that stem, and the earlier we can tell the air to split, and you'll see this even in pro stock with floor fins. So we have a roof fin and a floor fin. Same thing, what we're trying to do is thin the density out as it comes towards the guide, so the valve stem, doesn't create as much turbulence in the port, because what we're trying to do is really we're trying to reduce any wraparound turbulence, we're really just trying to manage how much turbulence that port has and reduce every aspect we possibly can. So yeah, I've done it in the early days. I've designed billet heads with actual valve shark fin type bosses in them. They look better on the dyno, they look better on the flow bench, and they'll have less cc's. So for instance, you'll knock that out and you might knock 2 or 3 cc's out of the twin cam port, right? Knock the divider down, grind the guide down. But when you look at flow figures, you have to compensate for the increase in volume. It's same as when we put a bigger valve in. If we put a 10% bigger valve in, but we only make 5% more flow, you actually went backwards.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? So even with that guide, if we can shape it and try and help the air get around the guide properly, and especially even on the backside, so it doesn't, because it's going to wrap around it. You see this, if you watch a tide come in, there's a pole in the ground, you'll see those eddies behind the pole, right? Behind the pier. And that's why you see even now when they design bridges, they're designing them like a long taper, almost like a shark fin, right? So the water is more streamlined past these, that way that they don't get as much degradation on the concrete on the backside, because that turbulence eats them away. Same thing with the port. If we can put a nice fin on the other side, as the air wraps around the guide, it now has a guide to go into the port, not wrap around back on itself and create more port drag. So there's definitely an aspect, and it keeps our port volume even smaller, because the best port in the world has no dead areas. And this is what we're trying to accomplish. We can never, ever get it perfect. And once you start, this is why you'll see ports have gone from rectangles with small radiuses to big ovals now, right? Because if you have 2 converging sides, so a roof and a wall, those 2 sides are going to create drag on each other. So when you probe that corner, if you've only got a little 5/8 radius, a 15/16, so an 8 mil radius, you'll find that corner's dead. So when we probe a rectangle port, we'll get this nice little oval of nucleus flow where it's actually flowing. So that tells you can pretty much close that whole port up and just make it a nice oval now.
No reduction in flow.
Yeah, now we've got optimal velocity. We might even see better flow figures on the flow bench, and we've reduced the volume. So now we have more port energy, which is going to help carry that inertia supercharging effect we we're talking about, because the average port energy feeds into that. So yeah, look, if they're only 2 or 3 mil, I'll take them out. But if, I see people cutting 7 mil out of them, and I think, man, just shape it and you'll do all right. But yeah.
Okay. Valve seats. This is another area that there seems to be a lot of debate over what's best. How many angles should we have to the valve seat? Should it be radiused? What can you tell us about the importance of the valve seat? 'Cause it's sort of, some people will say that's kind of the make or break to the performance of the head.
Yeah, all inductions have what I call area of priority. and it all starts at the valve seat. So the most important area of any cylinder head is the valve seat. The least important area is the throttle body, right? And that's so if we were going to do anything, so gains versus horsepower sort of deal, if we had a really, really bad seat, that might cost us 20, 30, 40 horsepower, right?
Oh, well.
Yeah. If we had a bad entry or bad radius, say we had a 5/8 instead of a 1/2 inch or something at the plenum, that might only cost us 8 horsepower. So it all starts at the valve seat. That's the most critical. And the further we get away, the less critical it is. So, yeah, definitely.
Somewhat irrelevant question, but just for my own interest. You're based in Australia and you've consistently throughout this interview so far used the imperial system for measurements. How do we get to this point?
I use both because a lot of the engine calculators, and even going back to what you said about, engine clearance, an inch per thou and stuff like that. So a lot of the rules and a lot of the engine calculators are all in imperial. So I always learnt both, and I tend to talk in both metric and imperial. But
I think on this side of the world, I 100% agree with you. On this side of the world, we're kind of forced into using both because at some point you're going to be inevitably sourcing engine components out of the US. And of course, the US is an imperial measurement system. So hence, yeah, you're shoehorned into it. I was just having this debate with our motorcycle engine guy, Luke, who's currently writing some motorcycle engine building content for a course that's coming up. And he's been going through my automotive engine course where I do use the imperial system, and he's like, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing this? Because in the motorcycle world, not so much, as it turns out. Yeah. Anyway, I mean, as long as you know how to convert between one and the other, it really doesn't matter, in my opinion.
yeah, that's it. Yeah, 100%. You got to live in both. But I like I said, if a lot of the calculators, especially like minimal cross-sectional area, they only work in imperial. So you can't put a metric. I've got calculators that I've converted, and now that will work on both. But generally, if people are looking online, they have to use imperial sizes. But yeah.
The actual logistics of creating a ported head, in the old days, it sort of comes back to what I was talking about that I despise, hanging on the end of a die grinder. I can only assume these days everything's being CNC ported.
No, all my heads are still hand ported.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, a hand port will beat any CNC'd head on the planet, and we guaranteed that. And it simply comes down to cost versus reward. Obviously, hand porting, there's far more work that goes into it, but there's also customization that goes into it, where CNC, it's only as good as the program.
Of course, yeah.
And like RBs and stuff like that, we make around 45 to 50 horsepower more at the same boost over a CNC'd RB head, and earlier boost thresholds because we have better velocity, right?
I guess my argument on that would be, cool, why can't we take your port that makes 40 to 50 horsepower more than a CNC port, digitize it, replicate it, and put that on the dyno, and we should be there?
Yep, no.
Okay.
No, and the reason why is comes down to core shift, and CNCs need to overcut. So they're generally bigger in cross-sectional area and lower in airspeed. So where it really, really works is in the aftermarket industry, where we cast a head small and we put the right size CNC port in. Then you're winning. Like that's NASCAR, Pro Stock, everything will do that. A lot of guys will just hand finish them, but you'll see when they cast a head, they cast it just with a thumb hole from the valve seat to the window. And now we can put what cross-sectional area we actually need. But the drama with OEM, so RBs, 2Js, especially that 90s era of twin cam, is a lot of them were already on the larger side. So RB26, for example, the minimal cross-sectional area in an RB26 doesn't start choking to 9,000 RPM, dead stock. So when you're porting it, what we tend to do is just attack the areas that need improving, but also compensate for the core shift. So we don't have to make the bowls bigger. We don't have to make the whole port bigger. So we can have a smaller port and even less CFM. So my hand ported ones flow about 285 CFM, and some of the digitized ones that I've helped with flow about 300 CFM. Same sort of port, but my port's only 130 cc's and their port's like 138 cc's. And this is why they'll make more horsepower. But even with the core shift, say we've got a little core that goes left and then in the next bowl it goes right, I can port and keep my cross-sectional area the same, even though it kicks a little bit left and it kicks a little bit right. It might only be 1 or 2 degrees, but 1 or 2 degrees isn't going to affect velocity because velocity is controlled by the CSA. But if I just go and hog that bowl out to where the core shift is rather than, fudging it a little bit, now my velocity might be 10, 20% lower at the valve seat. And then that's where I'm losing the energy.
Sure. Yeah, okay, that's a really interesting take on it. I guess from my perspective, not being directly involved with this, I would have assumed that one of the advantages with the CNC port profile is that, and again, I might be completely wrong here, that each port is going to be able to flow exactly the same. Hence, you're getting a more consistent airflow into each cylinder. Obviously, a lot of this still driven by the plenum itself, but all things being equal, which they're not, same airflow into each cylinder. So you're equalizing your air-fuel ratio across each cylinder. Any truth in that, or am I on the wrong track?
No, you're bang on. That's 100%. But the drama is it's outside the RPM window that we need. And it's same when you come down to manifold. So if you look at it like a Hypertune versus a Plasma Man. So I've worked with Plasma Man Alex and give him a little feedback, same as Jay from Real Street. He's helped him over the years, but he's shrunk his cross-sectional area at the window and now gone to an oval in a lot of the 2J stuff and gone to a smaller radius. And that manifold, at 8,500 will make more horsepower than a Hypertune. But then at 10,000 RPM, the Hypertune will make more horsepower because now it's coming into that velocity zone, that inertia. This is why we map the cross-sectional area and see what velocity dynamically it's going to have on a running engine. And like we said about the minimal cross-sectional area, getting it to that 600 feet per second is the key. So a CNC head, if I just do the maths on a 8,000 RPM RB26, we're about 550 feet per second. So we're not even in the range yet, where my hand-ported one's about 290. So I'm already 40 feet per second up on the CNC head. And that's the problem. And I'm still short. This is why I weld up the divider and try and prove it. The RB is actually too big for that engine. That's why they really come alive on the 2.3s and 3.2s and 3.4s. That's where they come into their own,
Yeah, okay. The bigger engine can actually use more of the flow.
100%. And that's where they really start to come alive,
Okay. All right. I'm going to guess I know the answer to this question, but are you leveraging any technology such as 3D scanning and CFD to help develop the ports, or is it purely sort of old school, tested on the flow bench and the dyno, I guess, ultimately?
Yeah, I have, but I find with CFD is much like a flow bench. It cannot tell you how good the cylinder head is or if it's the right size. So it's going to give you a great velocity gradient and show you, airspeed through the port and stuff like that. But at the moment, it'll get you 95% there. But the drama, as you know, at the race end, we're playing with 1s and 2s, not 5s, right? So it's about collecting as many 1% as you can, like you said, valve seat angles and stuff like that, port velocity.
I guess if it's a valid tool to a point, though, it could do a lot of good to get you close to the ballpark without having to spend hours hanging on a die grinder, physically porting a head and then testing it.
100%. And it's really good for those guys that don't quite understand engines properly because it'll get you in the ballpark to a certain extent, as long as you know what right data to put in. And depending on what system you're running, whether it's a RANS, because RANS is very basic. It makes a lot of assumptions. But I get a ton of people sending me because I help design manifolds for industry, like production manifolds and stuff like that. So I get them sending me a lot of CFD, and then I'll analyze the cross-sectional area and the engine and what they're actually doing for it and see if they're even in the ballpark. And they might look great on the CFD, but the sizings are wrong. The plenum opening's too big, the radius is too big, or you know what I mean?
So just a yet another example of garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, 100%. Like anything, it's only as good as what you put into it. And you've got to use other things. Like OEM manufacturers won't just use CFD. They're using Ricardo Wave. They're using a ton of other things. And their CFD's, $500,000, not like the stuff we would get off, CAD. But so they're not only doing what we call steady state, they'll actually do firing order and then use like D1 Ricardo wave to estimate the harmonics as well. So they're balancing both aspects of that, and then adjusting the CFD, and then looking at the sound aspects of the manifold, and getting it right from them. But again, a lot of OEM are driven for emissions, and there's other aspects there too. So
Yeah. Different priorities to us in the aftermarket. Of course.
yeah, that's right.
Okay, I guess this is probably an easy segue into the next topic, which is the design of intake manifolds. And I think there's as much confusion around this as there is in cylinder head porting as well. So I guess there's a lot of area to cover here. One of the first questions I'd have is what do people typically get wrong or misunderstand about an intake manifold or plenum design?
Generally, runner length and its size, and tapers, angles, all this sort of stuff. I think the biggest confusion is around that. I get some funny questions. I've had some funny questions over the years, even people's understanding as far as length goes, as far as torque versus, so short runner versus long runner. But my first question is, well, what's short and what's long?
Yeah, you've got to get a little bit more granular than that.
That's right. So some people might call a 12-inch a long runner and a 6-inch a short runner, but at what RPM and what harmonic are we targeting? The fourth harmonic, the third harmonic? And generally all race engines around the world, unless it's an emission engine or a restricted class, so just talk open, trying to make as much horsepower as we can, are targeting the third harmonic. That's the best balance between velocity and our harmonic sound element type deal, which is worth about 5 to 7% more horsepower.
That's no joke.
No.
Can you just briefly explain the sort of mechanism behind this third harmonic and how it actually aids cylinder fill?
Yep, we've got two. We've got a quarter wave and we've got a third harmonic. The third harmonic is when the valve is open. So what we're trying to do is time the valve when it closes. So basically, when the valve opens, we create a depression, a negative pressure. So we have a negative wave that runs up the runner at the speed of sound. Also, what we've got to realize is it's location dependent, meaning if it's in velocity, and we have this same problem in exhaust when some people try and calculate wave signals for exhaust, what they don't realize is if the medium is moving at 1,000 feet per second and the speed of sound is 2,000, now it's only moving at 1,000 relative to pipe length, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah.
Yes. So we have the same problem on the intake in a way that we need to compensate, but we generally just use averages, and they work at out about 1,085 at 25 degrees. So when the valve opens, we get a negative pressure wave that runs up to the plenum runner, right? To the opening of the plenum. The instant it hits that plenum runner, it will flip polarity and come back as a positive wave, right? With the negative wave goes into the plenum, but we get a polarity shift and that wave comes back down. Now it'll hit the valve seat, and it'll flip polarity again and then go back up and down. So what we're trying to do is time that positive wave to come back in right as the intake valve is closing. So this is a more dense zone of air. So think of boost. When we see boost, we're pushing the molecules of air together. That's how sound works. If you've ever seen a sound wave, the wave action, we have positive and negative pressure, right? So we'll get this positive vein of air that's more dense. And if we can get that into the cylinder just as the valve shuts, now we've got better cylinder filling. And again, like I said, that's worth about 5 to 7% more horsepower if we get that timed right. And that's what all your pro stock and top NA stuff is doing. And then we have our quarter wave, which is when the valve shuts. We have a positive wave that'll go up, invert, negative, come back down, negative, go back up, come back positive. And then if we can time that one right as the valve opens, we end up with a positive shift, especially on valve overlap, because this is where we have no piston speed. That there's nothing to generate a pressure offset. So what we're relying on is the negative pressure arriving as the exhaust valve opens, and this positive wave to help create that exchange and get better overlap to flush the cylinder out, right? Because we don't want that dead gas, the inert gas in there, because that costs us horsepower.
Of course. Yeah, it is quite a obscure sort of concept to get your head around. And again, we're not helping ourselves here without the benefit of some animations but we're doing the best we can here. So hopefully people are sort of still sticking around and understand this. The problem with that is what works at, let's say, 4,000 RPM, the length that works to capture that third harmonic is not going to be the same at 8,000 RPM. And this is where we get into that long runner is going to be beneficial for low RPM torque, and a short runner is going to be beneficial for high RPM torque and hence horsepower. So I guess anything and everything in engine design and development is a compromise. How do you decide on the compromise that's going to be suitable for a given engine application and hence the design of the intake manifold?
Well, if it's all out drag racing, most of those engines are only working in a 1500 RPM window. So from peak torque to peak horsepower, 1800 max. So we will target peak RPM for a harmonic thing. And like on super stocks and stuff like that, we're talking at about 10.5 inches. And that's total induction length. So you might have a 5.5, 6 inch port. So then you're going to end up with, 5-inch runner on top of that. Where if you're talking endurance or street, you generally want an inch or an inch and a half longer so the wave comes in earlier, because like in a circuit car, we want 3.5, maybe even 4,000 RPM range. And sometimes we're short shifting. We're not using that, let's say our red line's 8,500. We don't use the red line like a drag car will. Like a drag car needs to over rev as well, because we don't want to end up under our peak torque point. So depending on the gear ratio, if let's say the limit's 10.5, we might go in first gear 10.7, so that when we shift, we don't end up in a low torque position. You know what I mean? Where in a circuit car, it's not as bad. So what we try and do, you're looking at average numbers. So you'll even target different velocities at the entry of the port. So in a pro stock thing and a true third harmonic, we might only be 180 feet per second coming into the runner. Where in a circuit car, it might be 195, 200, right? Because we want better. We don't care if we lost 10 horsepower. If we made 50 horsepower at 5,000 and lost 10 at 7, it don't matter, because that's what we're going to use. It's
the area under the curve that's more important.
That's right, 100%, yeah. So in that aspect, you can play with the induction length and the cross-sectional area, because that's the other aspect that a lot of people don't get. I can make a short runner act like a long runner just by closing the cross-sectional area up and getting that average velocity up. And that's what we do in street tunnel rams, where we can't put a 14-inch runner in it. We can only put a 6-inch runner in it. So we'll close that CSA up. Holden are a great example of this,
Yeah, okay. In terms of theory versus reality, I'm just wondering how well the calculations validate once you hit the dyno. Like, are they spot on, or do you have to kind of go plus or minus, let's say, half an inch and see where it actually truly works out?
No, they're pretty good now. After sort of people have been playing with this probably since 1950, since Chrysler first started testing induction length. They had the rubber with the tubes, and they just move it up and down. That was just on a parallel tube. Obviously a runner needs to be tapered, and that changes the aspect a little bit. But with programs like Pipe Max, and I've got all my own ones now, I've also built a calculator platform called Einstein Motors, where I have them all on there. But they're within probably 100 thou now. So if you're chasing horsepower, you're probably talking calculator to real world is within about 100 thousandths in length.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, they're pretty much done to death in like motorsport.
I mean, it's great when the theory works out in reality, but my experience is that's not always the case.
Yeah. Now, with as long as you know the temperature of the air, because the physics doesn't change, and that's the brilliant thing about harmonic theory and calculating it. If you know the density, and we have our calculation, or a temperature, sorry, not density. Density won't affect the speed of sound. But if you know the temp, and this is where even in boosted application, we still tune third harmonic, and you'll see better horsepower per PSI and so on and so on, But it is very, very close. And same with the minimal cross-sectional area. And we actually did a video on YouTube for one of the big block manifolds that we were building. And I showed all the math and how we built it even before the engine was dynoed. And it was on a Sunset 632 big block. And in the States, they make about 40 horsepower from single plane to their tunnel ram. but they go to a fourth harmonic because they can't make the third harmonic. And I have a different theory on that. I tend to put more port energy in them. So I was actually 20 mil short on the third harmonic, but I still made it long because I wanted more average velocity. And we end up making 72 horsepower more. They make 40, yeah. And the car actually went on to win Drag Week Top NA, so Australia's fastest NA radial car.
That's impressive.
Yeah, we showed the math, no flow bench, no nothing, all on the whiteboard, and then built the manifold, no flow bench testing, no nothing. That's the other aspect. A lot of people go down the road or the rabbit hole flow testing manifolds. That can't tell you anything. You can get data off a cylinder head, but flow testing a manifold really won't tell you much at all, especially with a manifold that has uneven runner lengths, because again, you have to target different velocity factors and different cross-sectional areas. So if you actually get them right on the flow bench, they're wrong on the dyno or wrong in the real world.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that could really send you in the wrong direction with your development.
Yeah, definitely. And you see that with more so single planes, but we don't flow test any of our tunnel rams. They're all done by math, and they all within 1% of our calculations every time. Yep.
Okay. In terms of, next aspect I want to talk about with the plenum design is the actual plenum volume. So is there any rule of thumb on what this should be compared to maybe engine capacity, and how does varying it up and down affect engine performance?
There's a couple of rules, but it really comes down to what I call how much bias does the throttle body supply. So in other words, if we've got a forward-facing manifold, that probably has the worst bias of all, right? Versus, say, a tunnel ram. So a tunnel ram needs the lowest amount of plenum volume. So let's just take a target of, say, 7 to 7,500, right? The most of your common plenums in your turbo cars that with a bias plenum, they're going to start at around about 100%, 120% generally, right? That seems a really, really good compromise, because what I look at is exchange rates. So every 720 degrees at 100% will exchange 100% of that plenum volume. So now we're looking at how fast the velocity is in the plenum and how much it's going to rob the cylinders. So there's a slide rule that generally states as we increase RPM, we want more plenum volume, because we've got to reduce velocity to stop cylinder robbing. And we see this with small plenums, right? As we start to RPM, if you've got EGTs or anything like that, you'll see the separation starts to broaden much quicker. We might only have 3 or 4% at 7,000. We get to 8.5. Now we have 10, 12%, right?
Yeah, okay.
There's a slide rule. But when you look at, say, a tunnel ram, we start looking at line of sight. The line of sight between runner and throttle body, they're all exactly the same. So now we're able to reduce that plenum volume and increase the secondary harmonics in the plenum. So when we were talking about wave harmonics and that positive wave coming up the runner and inverting and going down the runner, well, that positive wave goes into the plenum. And we can harness that positive wave to help fill other cylinders. This is why common V8 plenums will have a far more smoother curve than, say, ITB. ITB, you'll see the rarefication points in the curve, the dips, right?
Yeah.
That's because we have no cylinder-to-cylinder positive swapping of that secondary harmonic, where a common plenum like a tunnel ram, we do, right? Or even your six-cylinder stuff, anything with a common plenum, we can help fill that rarefication wave that's coming out of another runner with a positive wave. So there's that aspect. And then with carbureted, we want to keep the plenum volume low enough that we're getting good booster signal, because as we start to move the carby away, we start to lose signal from that runner. Right. And we have a few aspects going on there. So you're obviously familiar with shear plates, right?
Yep. Oh, actually, let's explain that for people who haven't heard that term, though.
Yeah. So a shear plate is basically a plate that goes under a carburetor that'll have a really, really sharp edge and have voids under the side of it, right? And it has two functions. And you really need to use these on big camshaft, single plane manifolds that don't have a lot of plenum volume, and you're starting to get fuel distribution problems. And what that generally is that positive wave we talked about that comes up the runner, comes up and washes the booster signal out. So remember, that's a negative pressure we're trying to create in there to pull fuel. So as this positive wave comes up into the booster, it stops fuel flow.
So you're going to go lean.
Yeah, exactly. So what the shear plate does is, one, it allows the fuel to shear off, being a shear plate, so it allows it to fall and go into the runner. But the second aspect is it'll create two negative zones, or it'll create negative zones under the carburetor. So these eddies of negative pressure, right? Lower than atmospheric. So what actually happens is, as the positive wave comes up the runner into the plenum, it'll get attracted to the low pressure, because a high pressure always fills a low pressure. So rather than going up into the booster, it gets dampened out by those negative pressures under the carby.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So then in that aspect with the carby, we're able to reduce that plenum volume. So that 7,000 to 8,000 RPM figure, we're going to start at like 55, maybe 60% plenum volume. But as I was saying, we put the throttle body at the front. Now we've got more biases in the plenum, right? The throttle body has to work harder to supply air to all cylinders. We have more turbulence to deal with, because now we're trying to get, say, air from the throttle body to number 6 at the back over all these little explosions, because that's the other thing people don't understand. Up until peak torque, your engine's spilling back into the plenum. You got reversion coming up and these little explosions going off in your plenum, right? I think John Kazi showed this best when he put his finger in the manifold. I don't know whether you've seen that video.
I have not.
Oh, it's a great video. So look it up online, John.
We'll see if we can find that and chuck it in the show notes as well. Oh, also for my own personal sort of enjoyment.
Yeah. Basically, he's put his finger in the runner and nearly snapped his finger off because the wave harmonics going up and down. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think when you start diving into this, you sort of realize all of the assumptions that you've made maybe are completely out of order, and also just honestly, these things are much more complicated than you give credit to when you're just looking at it from a cursory perspective.
100%.
I'm interested, just because you mentioned ITBs. We're, I guess, at least on 4-cylinder stuff, maybe more so than V configuration stuff, the ITB is on a naturally aspirated engine is often kind of seen as the holy grail. That's the epitome of performance. Pros and cons versus a plenum and a single throttle or double throttle body.
Yeah, we get a bit. I've been doing a little bit with Dave from Skunk 2 Racing. They've got one of the fastest pro stock Hondas in the world. They're 11,000 RPM, I think they're doing now, ITB, and they run the Kinsler. Yeah, I don't know. I think ITBs are brilliant for torque on demand, because if we need less cross-sectional area, we just give it less throttle and it creates more turbulence and it eats up that cross-sectional area. So that's why they've been brilliant for circuit cars. But I think all-out power, we've done a couple of back-to-backs on V8s, so like LS7s and stuff like that. Admittedly, we've gone to a shorter runner, but from like the Gen V stuff, which is a reasonably good ITB setup, because the ITB, the general rule is the further we get the throttle body away, the better, because all ITBs will create a trailing wake, generally 5 to 6 inches at 300 feet per second. And those little eddies, and there's an actual physics term, I can't remember what it's called, but every inch it travels, the eddy will halve its size. So if the eddy was, half an inch, it'll be a quarter by an inch and so on. So you get a degradation phase after that. So that tends to eat up a little bit of cross-sectional area. So this is obviously why Formula One went to barrel valve. I think that's the optimal, because then we can actually...
You've got zero sort of turbulence when it's wide open throttle.
That's right, because the other aspect, you'll see this in Europe, some of them get right into, instead of having a shaft and a butterfly, they'll CNC the whole plate and screw into the end of it. So it's all one piece, so it's smooth. And they've done CFD, and it's, like 12% reduction in turbulence and all that sort of stuff, make it a little bit more horsepower. But we did a back-to-back. I think we made an extra 120 horsepower with a common plenum.
Interesting.
Yeah, so but I'd like to do some more testing on that.
I think a colleague of mine who used to work for me, he's actually been on the podcast, Chris, who now runs his own tuning shop, Prestige Tuning in Wellington, and he was doing some work on a V8 touring car with an LS7, and they put the Harrop ITB setup on, which is cringingly expensive, and he tuned it, and it wasn't really a step forward. And I think they ended up making more power everywhere using the MSD Air Force intake manifold over the Harrop, which is also substantially cheaper. So sometimes ITBs aren't the be all and end all.
Yeah, my theory is that you should be able to make 3 to 5% more with a perfect common plenum design over ITB. And I've sort of seen this a little bit when we've done tests with ITB building plenum boxes over the ITB. We tend to smooth the horsepower curve out. And even if we haven't made any more peak, our average seems to be better because we've got a smoother curve. And I've had a few guys in Europe that I help. They've played around with carbon fiber air boxes and bits and pieces, and they're claiming around about 3 to 5% better horsepower. So, yeah, I don't know.
I think the other part of this that is worth mentioning is, while clearly tuning on ITBs is not complex, I think it's fair to say that tuning a common plenum just off map is probably still easier in general than tuning an ITB engine.
Definitely.
Yeah, so that's something you can't completely ignore. Another one that sort of feeds into this, I think, a pun not intended, but is the throttle body. And there's, again, a huge amount of debate and sort of misinformation around throttle body sizing. I think in my experience, most people probably oversize the throttle body. What do we need to know about this, and what are the downsides if we go too big or too small? Too small, I guess, is we make less power, but give us what we need to know.
Yeah, I think that, like you said, especially in the turbo game, a lot of guys, you see, the RB is a perfect example, 100 mil throttle bodies and stuff like that, where an 85 or even a 76, 75 would do the job, depending on horsepower and RPM. I generally target them to about 150 feet per second of engine mass volume, what they're using. So that way it's a sliding scale to RPM. The more RPM you got, the more CFM you're going to use, the higher the airspeed becomes at the throttle body. So circuit stuff, I'll target about 200 feet per second, and the all out horsepower stuff at about 150 feet per second. And that's roughly what even the new Pro Stock targets theirs at. So their oval Holly throttle body at 25 square inches, that 1500 odd horsepower works out about 150 feet per second through the throttle body. Like what you're saying, smaller throttle body costs you horsepower because the airspeed becomes too fast, then the throttle body starts to become the choke, too much turbulence. But at 150 feet per second, it's very, very minimal. You could possibly push that to 125 if you're trying to make, that last 1% on the dyno, but the 150 feet per second target seems to be the best approach from what I've tested. And like you said, what you're going to lose, generally, it's hard to hurt even torque with a bigger throttle body, but what you lose is that throttle sensitivity, right? So the driving ability. Now, all your engine is in the first 15%, not,
Yeah, I think that's something that's very easy to completely miss, is the drivability that a big throttle body loses, and the inability to accurately modulate the torque output of the engine. And particularly if you've got a powerful engine, that could be really problematic. Granted, drive-by-wire throttles, with the way we can map pedal position versus throttle position, we can work around a bit of this. But, ultimately, if you're in that situation, the answer is you've got a throttle body that's bigger than you need. I like your analytical approach here. I think I guess probably 99.9% of people are choosing a throttle body based on how they feel on the day, what the weather's doing, or what their buddies put on his car last week, as opposed to having a line in the sand. This is the airspeed we're looking for. Now we can calculate what size throttle body actually fits that application.
That's right. And it's the same thing with air cleaner. It's the same thing with everything. That's why I built all my calculators even on air cleaner size, right? So you can calculate the surface area and the required feet per second that you need before it becomes a velocity restriction. You see that even in turbo cars. Most of them have a pod that's too small. And now you're starting to see it even in some of the big Mustangs. Now that they're needing to make 800-900 horsepower, they're even putting twin airboxes on some of the Dark Horse and stuff like that now, because they need so much surface area. Otherwise, the velocity through the air cleaner is just going choking the engine,
Yeah, no, fair point. Just coming back to the ITB thing, and this might be a moot point in light of what you've said about runner length. I think one of the perceived advantages is that it's very easy to change your trumpet length to affect your overall intake length, and hence on the dyno, play around with some different trumpets and tune the power and torque curves to get them exactly where you need. But again, as per our conversation, maybe we can just calculate that and be done in one go. So irrelevant.
Yeah, and we've seen this transition even with like supercars, hypercars, and everything. Ferrari was very much ITB, Lamborghini. So now they're all gone to that common plenum type design, parallel roof. They're trying to harness that secondary harmonics. They have smoother horsepower curves now. But I think the best advantage and why you still see it in superbikes and all that is because they're torque on demand. They're not at full throttle all the time. Even the best riders, I think they average 62%, at full throttle around the whole track. So, and you'd know this driving an ITB car. The worst thing you can do is just go flat to the floor at $2,000. If you squeeze the throttle, you'll make more torque, right? You'll come out of the corner faster, right? In a circuit car. If you're giving it 50% throttle versus full throttle, at say 3,500 out of the corner, if you just back that throttle off more, the car will actually pull out of the corner quicker. You'll see your torque go up, right? And that's that torque on demand, because we're creating more turbulence, which basically dynamically shrinks the port for you.
So somewhat counterintuitive, really.
Yeah, it is a little bit, yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's move on. We're getting a little bit long here. I just wanted to sort of finish off, I guess, with asking you if there's a particular engine or project that sits in your mind as something you're sort of most proud of, or something you learned the most, or maybe something that just completely disintegrated on the dyno and you didn't know why.
Yeah, I've got a few. I don't know, probably one of my first twin turbos pushing a factory block. It's probably well over 20 years ago now. That taught me a lot of lessons. Touch wood, it never broke, but we end up pushing a factory 010 block to 1,200 horsepower. Yeah, I still get people today calling BS. So yeah, that was my.
What do you think it was about that particular engine that held together?
RPM, I think. Yeah, RPM. So we limited RPM to basically 7,000 RPM. So we made, I broke all the rules. I put small ARs on it. Admittedly, I did use tune length runners, like exhaust manifolds on it. We had a tunnel ram on it. We had a fair bit of plenum volume. We had an ice cooler, which we actually made out of 3 Nissan 33 coolers, the ones that go at the factory ones that go under the guard. So we cut the tanks off them. I welded 3 together and made a tapered plenum and put it inside an ice box. And even that, I think we've seen like 19 degrees inlet air temps. Even, I think, 10, 12 dyno pulls in, we're still only at 21. So,
wow.
Yeah, that was really a lesson for me, and it really opened my eyes to how easy turbo cars were for making horsepower. You know what I mean?
Well, here's one thing I'll say about that. And yes, they are, obviously. But when it comes to trying to keep a factory block together, they can also be your worst enemy, because they'll make so much low-end torque. And I think it's until you realize that it's actually cylinder pressure and hence torque that we need to manage. And it's very easy to wind the turbo boost up and break the engine because you're making too much cylinder pressure. Whereas if you're actually a little bit smart about that, and the flip side of that is what you mentioned there, keeping the RPM under control. Because in my opinion, the 2 killers of an engine will be cylinder pressure or torque and RPM. So you want to manage both of those, but a really powerful trick to keep an engine together, making a lot of power where it's got some known weak points, maybe the connecting rods, is hold the boost low until you're past peak torque, and then you can ramp that boost in as the RPM increases. So you're actually sort of getting a flatter torque curve, and you're managing that cylinder pressure. But of course, torque multiplied by RPM divided by 5,252 is our power. So more torque at higher RPM, happy days.
Yeah. We've seen that with the 2Js, the stock bottom end. It helped a lot of guys back in the early days. And I think even old Rocco and a few of them were running like 7 seconds with like junkyard engines, And then the precision turbos come out, and they were bending rods left, right, and center because they were coming on about 600-700 RPM earlier, right at that 3,500 RPM on a stock 2J rod, and they were just going bending up. But yeah, you're 100% right.
Yeah, I mean the other little tuning trick we can use there is as opposed to, or as well as boost, of course, is to back off the timing through that peak torque. There's pros and cons with each technique, but those are kind of the 2 main levers that we have available to pull.
Yep, definitely.
All right, Jake, it's been an amazing chat. Actually, before we get on to closing this off, just one thing I wanted to mention that's become very apparent as we've gone through this discussion is that you're incredibly smart when it comes to all of these aspects. And I'm wondering how much of this you picked up in study before you started your career versus how much you've kind of picked up and learned and studied along the way since you've been building engines, or is it both?
Yeah. Everything was study originally. So basically, I worked with a few guys along the way, and I found that they would just test stuff blindly, and it might have took them 10, 12 goes to find the right combo. So I started off really, really early in studying engineering and studying all the things. So I went out to prove my theories, and I found that I could get it right within 2 or 3 goes. So I found I didn't need to do as much testing, and I could get the results faster because I had a better understanding of those engine fundamental principles. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That makes perfect sense.
So yeah, that tended to help me a lot. And the other aspect was we never specialized in one engine. I did an array of engines, twin cams, 2 valves, small block Chev Fords, and RBs and SRs, and it helps you see the common denominators between all the engines, and that's airspeed, cross-sectional area, and that really helped me bring it all together to go, well, it's all physics. If we understand the physics, then we can apply that to any engine, and it works. Obviously, we just need to understand what are like you said, the weak points of a particular engine, SR20 or a rod in this engine or a block in that engine, like the 1UZs. I think the limitations is about that 1,500 horsepower that we're finding now,
Yeah, I like when you mentioned the SR20, you just left that as the overall overarching problem with that particular engine. Yeah, maybe I agree. Hasn't been a good engine to me, at least anyway. I think what you're saying there as well, it sort of almost mirrors my attitude to tuning different engines. I think a lot of people will believe that if you haven't tuned 100 2JZs, well, you can't come fresh in and get good results out of a 2JZ or sub in your particular engine of choice. The reality is, and you kind of alluded to this maybe not being entirely right, but I do call the engine an air pump, which essentially it is. And if you understand the operating principles of an engine, you understand how fuel injection works and the principles of tuning, I can apply that broadly, completely blind to an engine on a dyno I can't even see. And I'll go through and tune the engine. I'm going to get good results out of it. There is no magic here, I don't believe.
100%. And understanding nearly every engine wants that timing to land at that 10 to 14 degrees after TDC. That's where we want our peak cylinder pressure. And like you said, early or late is only going to hinder us, right? We hit it too early, we're going to get pre-ignition detonation and so on. But yeah, once you got the fundamentals and what air fuels work with what fuels, you know what I mean? What type of fuels you're using. Yeah, it's pretty, like you said, in all the engines I've tested, the air fuel, the same fuel with different engine combos might only change by 0.2 of an air fuel,
Yeah, there's a few, I've sort of said this in a couple of podcasts recently, so I won't go over the same story again and again, but I mean, I do think a lot of tuners will go into every engine tuning project with a locked in, like, this is the air fuel ratio I'm going to run. And you'll be able to get results, don't get me wrong. Engines don't vary that much. But I do suggest that a little bit of experimentation, particularly on an engine that you've found is not limited. You're not at MBT and you can't get any more timing into it. Well, sure, let's see. Does a richer air fuel ratio cool the combustion charge enough that I can now creep in 2-3 degrees more timing and net gain in power and torque? That's just sensible, I believe.
And understanding that the air fuel itself has an acceleration factor, right? So different air fuel ratios have different flame front speeds, so they'll actually change our delivery timing.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Because you get a lot of people, they'll chase an air fuel and then put timing in, but if they just adjusted the air fuel, they can put more timing in, and there's a little dance there, and then
it is definitely a bit of a dance. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but no, you're 100% right.
All right, we'll move on to wrapping this thing up, and as always, we've got the same 3 questions we ask everyone. The first of those questions is, what's next in the future for you?
Next is we're building just my calculator platform, Einstein Motors, and we're going to build hopefully another factory out at Bathurst, back to where Bain Racing all started 4 generations ago with my grandfather, because he designed Mount Panorama. It was because him and my grandfather were drinking buddies. So and he used to race down the old Vale dirt road. That's when they used to race. So he talked him into building a racetrack, and that became Mount Panorama. So we're going back there, and we're probably going to go into a few more street cars, because I have my son coming up into the business now. So he does some of my engine program now and some of our manifold welding and fuel tanks and stuff. But what I want to do is take him back to grassroots and get him tuning some street cars, because I think the best engine builders are also tuners. They tell a story. If you can lean an engine out, then pull it down, have a look at the valve seat, have a look at the exhaust valve, see what it's doing to the seat, see what it's doing to the rings, and understand, or vice versa, run it too rich and watch how your rings tear up and stuff like that, and just help him understand both sides of the fence. I think it'll make him a better engine builder and a better tuner,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that maybe I haven't really highlighted for myself as well. When I was deep in the 4G63 drag racing world, and we had a lot of success with my own car, so of course we ended up with a lot of customers running 4G63s for drag racing, and there was a handful, maybe 3 or 4 engines that I did that were methanol, sort of 12 to 1500 horsepower capable. And it was quite nice being able to build the combinations, which were essentially all identical, send them out, do a season of drag racing, and get them back and get to tear them down. And you could start iterating on things like piston to cylinder wall clearance, maybe the bearing clearances, maybe the ring end gap, and kind of see how that actually panned out over a season of drag racing. And that kind of accelerates your learning, I think. Off the back of customers, but they're still getting great results, so everyone's happy.
That's right. Yeah, they all tell a story, and you can definitely learn a lot from just looking at even the burn pattern on the piston. Like we do that we'll run an engine on the dyno and just pull the intake manifold off and look at the intake port and see where the injector is, if it is wetting down anywhere in the intake port, just to give us an idea of what the injector, like even that conical angle, we've played with that, and trying to get it midstream, not shoot at the valve. Like a lot of people think the best position for an injector is at the back of the valve, but even the Yamaha testing has shown you'll actually make less horsepower, where if you move the injector back a little bit and shoot it midstream, so that 37 degrees to floor but midstream, so it catches it, and time it properly in the ECU, you'll actually make more horsepower, because your SMD, that solder mean diameter of the fuel molecule, actually ends up smaller going into the combustion chamber, and that's what we're trying to get, the best homogenized mix.
I think I fell into this trap as well, playing around with injection timing and thinking that the perfect timing would clearly be to inject on an open valve. And then you sort of realize that actually that's not the case, because even what looks like a finely atomized mist of fuel coming out of a good quality injector, the size of the fuel mist, liquid fuel, essentially what I'm trying to say, doesn't burn very well. What we actually want to do is inject against the port wall and the hot valve, and then it's going to evaporate, go through that phase change from liquid to gas, and then we're inhaling a gaseous form of fuel, which is much, much easier to ignite.
Yeah, that's right. That's what even we did dyno tests. We moved the injector up and up and up the runner, and even 3 inches, we made, I think, 14 or 18 horsepower on just a baby 450 horsepower engine, because we got more time. And like you said, another quick fallacy is that carburetors don't atomize fuel as well. Their solder mean diameter is nearly 10 times smaller than an average injector. So yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep into this debate. There's always been sort of an argument, mainly from the fuel injector crowd, that fuel injection is going to make more power than a carburetor. And I think I believed that for the longest time. And then once you sort of start digging into it, all things being equal, which clearly they never are, that actually maybe is not the case. And the carburetor still can do a very good job. The carburetor does a very good job under specific conditions. And as soon as those conditions change, all bets are off.
That's right. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, carby generally is about 2% more horsepower.
Right. That's probably a podcast for a different
Definitely.
day. Right. You probably touched on this earlier, but I don't know if there's anything more you want to follow up with, or anything else you want to add. Is there any advice you give to a younger version of yourself to help reach where you are today in your career faster?
Yeah, just read as much as you possibly can and understand what you're seeing. A lot of times we'll do something and make horsepower and not understand why. And I fell into this trap years ago with plenum volume on the dyno. With a tunnel ream, you can put more and more plenum volume in an engine and make more and more horsepower on a dyno, but go slower at the racetrack. And that comes back to that signal. So try and understand what you're doing and try and only change one thing at a time. Don't change, especially if you're doing like testing and you want to validate your ideas and theories. Only change one thing at a time, because if you change two or three things, you don't know what made the horsepower. You don't know.
That was actually a problem I often found myself in with my own drag car. And we had a budget that was essentially non-existent, and you had a limited amount of time, and ultimately I needed to be spending my days working on customer cars to fund this drag racing addiction anyway. So you could never just make the one change. It was the compression ratio, and it was the injectors, and it was the plenum, and it was the turbo size, and cool, we made another 100 horsepower. Well, which of those changes? And maybe if we hadn't made one of those changes, it would have been 120 horsepower or 150. But difficult. You can only do what you can do, I think.
Yeah, I see a ton of that in the industry. They'll do 3 or 4 things and then they've lost 50 horsepower and they're scratching their head. Which one was it?
Yeah. It's a tricky situation. All right, our last question for today, Jake, if people want to follow you and see what you're up to, and I highly recommend they do. We've scratched the surface here, but in researching this podcast, your YouTube channel and by definition there, your Instagram as well, is an absolute goldmine of information for those who want to dive way deeper than we have today. So yeah, how do they find you?
Yeah, pretty much YouTube, Bain Racing. Yeah, that's probably the easiest approach. And Facebook, we put a little bit of stuff up on there, but yeah. The YouTube's where it's at if you're interested in engine science and airflow and everything engines. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. As usual, those links will all be in the show notes. Look, Jake, it's been great to dive into this. I was probably through a lot of this right at the very limit of my own knowledge, and I don't profess to be a cylinder head porter. As I mentioned, I'm quite happy to leave that to those who know what they're doing. But yeah, you filled in a few blanks for me and hopefully also for those listening. So thanks for your time.
Awesome, not a problem.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Tuned In, and don't forget, by using the code podcast500 at checkout, podcast listeners can get a huge $500 off our VIP package, which includes over 40 current courses, as well as a long list of courses to be released in the future. As a VIP, you'll also get lifetime access to our members-only webinars and our community forum. Lastly, we'd love it if you could leave a review or comment on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback really helps us to reach a wider audience, which in turn allows us to continue bringing you more high-quality guests. As a thank you, each week we'll randomly select a review or comment from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube and send the winner a free HPA t-shirt shipped anywhere in the world. It's also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and if your review or comment is chosen, I'll do my best to answer them directly. So this week, a big shout out to Daniel Field 8232 from YouTube, who has said, great episode, always good to learn from old school race engineers. They have a lot of valuable lessons to pass on. Keep up the good work. Well, thanks for your feedback there, Daniel, and we'll certainly do our best to keep these episodes coming. In the meantime, if you reach out with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh tee shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.